We went ape over Donkey Kong Country's 25th anniversary a week or two ago. Not only did we publish an in-depth analysis on what made the game so great, but we also interviewed several members of the development staff, including Greg Mayles, Steve Mayles, Chris Sutherland, and David Wise. If you somehow missed them, make sure to check them out using the links in the description below. It is truly great stuff. Now, if you did catch them, then you might remember that at the end of each one, I teased that we had even more questions coming up from our Patreon backers that we'd be publishing at a later date. And, well, that time has finally come. So here we are bringing you even more questions and answers directly from the original development staff. And there's some great stuff here too, including a response I mistakenly teased in the primary interview video about sabotaging renders. But hey, it's finally coming to you now. So with all that out of the way, let's get to it, starting with Greg Mayles. That's most of our questions, but if you have time, we'd love to ask you a few more questions from our Patreon backers, just from our fans.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
All right, awesome, great, thanks. So we have one here from CamX60 who asks, hi, my question is, what gave you guys the idea to make the minecart levels, and why did the Kongs shoot out of barrels?
Okay. Two very good questions. Fairly easily answered, actually. The minecart was Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. As I previously said, I was a massive Indiana Jones fan. So even though the second film was nowhere near as good as the first one, what was awesome was the minecart section, and I was so influenced and so like wowed by it. I remember we had a copy of Temple of Doom on Laserdisc of all things at Rare, which I played endlessly. And when I was designing the minecart, because that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to make a playable Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom minecart. So that's where that came from. The barrels were basically when we were trying to come up with ideas for the levels in the game. I basically sat down and kind of came up with all the things you associate with gorillas or monkeys or the simian family. So obviously there was the bananas and kind of ropes to climb. But then when we went down to the local zoo, we noticed that the gorillas had got tires to kind of mess around in or pick up and chuck around or throw around. And there was also barrels in there as well that they were like standing on in the enclosure. So we just thought, okay, well that's kind of all gorilla-y stuff. Let's put tires and barrels in the game as well. But rather than standing on the barrels, we kind of hit upon the idea of being able to get in them. And then from then it just progressed that. As part of the kind of fast-flowing gameplay that I wanted throughout the game, being able to get in the barrels and then fire yourself out of them just became it was almost like a natural evolution of, we're going to have these barrels, we want the Kongs to get in them. What's going to happen when they get in them? Oh, let's fire the Kongs out of it. And then from then on it was like, let's have a string of barrels in a row that you can fire yourselves between. And before we knew it, we ended up with entire levels full of barrels where you're firing yourselves out all over the place. But certainly the original vision wasn't an entire level of barrels. As with many things in games design, you start off with something small and then you add to it, or somebody else will add something else to it, and before you know it, you end up with like a bigger thing. But it certainly doesn't usually start off as the big thing.
All right, well, we have a question from David Mott as well. And David says, how did it feel being one of the few companies outside of Japan to work for Nintendo? I think you kind of touched upon this earlier, but I imagine it was quite a thrilling feeling.
Oh, extremely. I mean, at the time, I probably didn't feel it as much as when I did years later, or even now looking back at it, because the advantages of youth are that you just take everything in your stride and don't really think about things like that. So kind of us being invited to go over to Nintendo to show them what we were working on, it was great to go to Japan and visit Nintendo, but at the time it was almost just like, I think I was more looking forward to getting free drink on the aeroplane at the time. than the prospect of visiting Nintendo. Obviously, it was great at the time being there and seeing Kyoto and talking to all the guys at Nintendo, and kind of looking back, I guess I appreciate just what a great position that was to be in, and what an experience it was. And I mean, even when I see some of the Nintendo guys now, I mean, I don't see them nowhere near as much as I used to. We still have a chat, and we still remember Donkey Kong and us visiting them and us talking about what to do in the game. So yeah, I mean, it was to get exposure to a company like that and their employees who are basically creating some of the best games in the world at such a young age. It couldn't help but it certainly developed me as a designer. And to do that so early on in my career, I think it's stood me in good stead in all these years since.
Well, we have a question here from Adam Harris, who asks, some people believe that the release of Donkey Kong Country helped to extend the life of the SNES at a critical time when it was competing head-to-head with the Sega Genesis. Was that intentional, or was that a happy accident?
Happy accident, I'd say. It was a happy accident. I mean, you can't be blasé enough to think, oh yeah, we're gonna make this game, or even Nintendo going, oh yeah, we'll get this UK company that we've never worked with to make a game that's going to extend the life of our hardware by another 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. I mean, you'd never predict that, but obviously there was a gap between the Super NES and the N64, so our games being able to play a major role in spanning that gap was a great thing, but it's certainly something you couldn't plan for. So yeah, it was a happy accident. It was great. Everyone was very happy. We certainly were, because a lot of people had already moved on to developing games for the new platforms. So at the time when the Donkey Kong games are out, even though they looked unique and hopefully played half decently, there wasn't a huge amount of competition, which allowed them to be part of the reason why they were successful as they are, and why it extended the life of the hardware.
Right. Well, Adam Harris got 2 questions in. So the second one, you've kind of answered this already, but there's one portion here which I'm quite interested in. So he says, what was it like working with Nintendo and essentially redefining one of the most popular characters? Was it Nintendo's idea to make DK a hero, or was that a pitch from Rare that needed approval?
It was our idea to make him a hero. Their remit was very broad in that they wanted us to take one of their IP and basically create a game that had graphics better than Aladdin. That was pretty much our remit, because Aladdin was the on the Genesis or the Mega Drive was the yardstick for graphics at the time. It was like it had that very cartoony Disney look to it, so they wanted something where the Super NES could compete with it. So they basically said, "Oh, take Donkey Kong and make us a game that can basically blow Aladdin out the water." So we didn't think there'd be much mileage making Donkey Kong a bad guy like he is in the arcade game. So it was a fairly easy decision straight away to make him the good guy and then develop it from there. Mm-hmm. But as I say, working with Nintendo was a real privilege, just to kind of see the way they worked, and of course when you get creative people together, you're not always going to agree 100% on things, but I think the difference between creative people where you work together, you end up with a better result rather than clashing. So even when there's like a to and fro on ideas, the important thing is you end up with a better result. And I think that's true even of today, but certainly with Nintendo, it always felt like if they'd ever make a comment about something, it was always to try and make something better. And then we'd like look at it and go, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How can we take what they're saying and incorporate it into the game? Mm-hmm. I certainly can't remember something where they mentioned something and then we'd go, no, that's just nonsense. We're not going to do that. Oh no, hang on a second. Although one of the guys at Nintendo did tell us when we first visited that he wasn't sure whether our game where the players would be able to play it because it looked too 3D.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah. Eventually, we took it as a compliment, but I think at the time it was such a departure from what games looked like, and certainly the games that they were making. But even if you look at Donkey Kong Country, it might look, at the time it might have looked really 3D, but you played it in 2D. Donkey still ran along effectively these 3D paths and these 3D pseudo 3D environments. They were actually 2D, so it wasn't really too 3D at all, but it made me smile at the time. it still does when I recall it, being told the game was too 3D.
That is pretty great.
The foreground and background are still really distinguished, so I'm not quite sure how that would have confused anybody. But
yeah, the parallax scrolling, I think it was all the layers that would put in it as you went along. You scrolled along, and then there was the foreground with the jungle. Then there was like the mid level with the smaller trees, and then there was the sky scrolling along in the background. And then, of course, by the time we got to the snow level, we were like really going to town with all the with all what we'd learned building the other levels. We just went nuts, pushing the limits of the hardware with the blizzard in all directions.
If we review Everwild, our complaint's going to be too 3D.
No, you need to come up with something else. Maybe it looks too nice, or something equally as thing, or I don't know. It's hard to come up with comments like that these days.
Yeah, this game plays too well.
That's a new one. Yeah, it's just too satisfying to play. I'll definitely take that if that's what someone wants to say about our game.
For sure. We have a question here from Gentleman Gamer who asks, how did you geniuses decide to come up with Donkey Kong Country's incredible musical style? I don't think any other game at the time dared to create a soundtrack whose songs incorporated natural sounds like the screeches of a monkey or the rustling sounds of leaves alongside a melody. It created something musically distinct that hasn't often been replicated since. So yeah, how do you guys pull it off?
It's first of all, very, very kind compliment. Unfortunately, I can't take any credit for it whatsoever. That was our musician David Wise. I think you're, without wanting to put words in his mouth, you'd have to speak to Dave. I think the music was just an extension of what the graphics looked like, where we'd created these very realistic looking environments. So to have what you consider typical video game music kind of plink plonking away on top of it just wouldn't have fitted. So I think Dave went away and tried to come up with music that fitted the graphics that we created. So the jungle looked, at the time, obviously it looked like a real jungle, or it looked believable. So having drums in there and kind of chanting made sense. And then when you're in the cave, we wanted to make it feel like you're in the cave, so that's why the music incorporates water dripping into it and things like that, or like clanking and banging, so we could have the echoing of the caves. And probably certainly my personal favourite piece that Dave wrote was the underwater music in the coral level, which was incredibly like relaxing.
Yeah.
And even some of the team were like, this music's just bizarre. Like, how can we have this level where you're going along and you're being attacked by all these underwater things, and then you've got this like really relaxing music that sounds like something from Enya or some kind of tribal thing in the background, but it absolutely suited the level. And I think to my day it's certainly my top 3 of rare pieces of music that's ever been made, along with, I think, one of the nighttime themes in Viva Pinata I really love. Not that I'd ever tell Grant Kirkhope that, because he's big-headed enough as it is. And then I think some of the Sea of Thieves music that Robin Beanland's done recently as well, I think that'll round out my top 3. But certainly Dave's underwater music still sticks in my mind as one of the best pieces of music that Rare's ever done. And it was such the right thing to do. Even at the time, it felt a little bit uncomfortable that it was such a departure from what we were used to, but it was certainly the right thing to do, and it just fits the game. And it's hard to imagine Donkey Kong Country without that kind of music in it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's basically a third pillar of the game. Like the visuals, the gameplay, and the soundtrack. I can't imagine any of them existing without the other.
It is, and if you were making games today, there'd probably be some document somewhere that said this is how all the three things are going to work together. But certainly back in those days, we just largely made things up as we went along, or people would look at what someone else had done and go, okay, I'll go off and write some music that kind of fits what the game looks like. There certainly wasn't. These days, with the games being so big and costing so much money and having so many people work on it, you need like a really cohesive vision of how everything fits together, because without that it just descends into chaos. But certainly for games like Donkey Kong Country, there was the freedom to experiment and come up with things, and more often than not you would end up with a really happy accident. But looking back on it, or people that have played it, they probably think we had this grand scheme of how everything fitted together, but that certainly wasn't the case.
Alright, and that was pretty much all the Patreon questions for Greg Males, except for one more, but we already included that in the full interview with him. So again, make sure to check that out using the links in the description below. Otherwise, let's go ahead and move on to Steve Males and Chris Sutherland, who had answers of their own for these Patreon questions. This first one comes to us from Oliver Webb, who asks, did anyone think you were crazy when you said you wanted to take 3D models from these SGI workstations and squash them down into sprites? Thanks.
Yes, and so I guess we kind of touched on it earlier, but when you said, did anyone think you were crazy? One of those people was me, and there's other people at Rare as well who were also saying this isn't going to work, and kind of like we said, we said, oh well, let's give it a go anyway and see what happens, and just as well we did. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation now, and we would have just. I guess that would have been particularly galling, wouldn't it? Imagine the people that said no, it's not going to work. Imagine those people are listened to, and then a few years later, someone had gone, "Oh, we're going to do this amazing rendered graphics," and it wouldn't have been Rare. That would have been disastrous, wouldn't it? So I think it always makes sense, shoot for the moon.
I'm glad we're in this timeline as opposed to that timeline where it didn't happen.
We also have Al Borlancourt, who says, I've heard that CGI workstations used to make pre-rendered graphics are quite expensive. I was wondering if you had any scares with the major equipment, like not powering on or seemingly refusing to work.
There weren't scares so much in that sense. They did work. Oh, actually, they did work okay. I'm just thinking there was one case where I remember having to fly with Tim Stamper to Miami, to the US, to try because I was because we had this machine and I was the only one who knew Unix at the time, and so I was there having to help set this machine up with him in the US. So there's things like that, but then we got people in who actually knew what they were doing rather than me, who just barely remembered stuff from university. But then there was, in terms of scaring things, we did find that those machines, because they were, I guess, from back in an era where there was no concern about network security or anything, they were all networked together, and you could log into anybody else's machine while they were still running whatever they were running, and they wouldn't be having any awareness. It was like a multi-user. Each one machine was like a multi-user system. So what would then happen was somebody like Grant Kirkhope would log into your machine when you weren't aware of it, and then he would then run a command which would play a sample that he'd recorded through your machine, and then you just hear a whole stream of different things that would just emit from your machine, and he'd be able to change the volume level remotely from another area in a different building, and obviously he'd just sit there laughing, and we'd just not know what was going on.
That sounds like an extreme version of what I used to do back in middle school, where I think all the Macs we had were linked, and you could change the desktop, the files in the desktop. You could change their color. I used to get such a kick out of that. So I kind of understand where Grant's coming from here, but that sounds like some next level trolling.
We had, I think it's called a challenge. This supercomputer. So this was like a machine that we'd do big renders on, so it was often renders you'd leave going overnight, and sometimes you come in the morning and think, oh god, it's bloody crashed again. And on further investigation, you found out that it hadn't crashed, somebody had actually killed the render. So what used to happen is that people would wait till like, say, midnight or 1 in the morning, whenever the last person left, and they'd see what was running on the Death Star, and they'd kill that render and replace it with their own render, because if you had multiple renders going, it'd slow by half every time. So they'd kill your render and set theirs going and come in the morning, and they're like, "Oh no, your render must have crashed. Oh, mine's all right." So there was quite a bit of that.
Who was it that was normally killing the renders? Was it one person in particular, Steve?
Well, I don't want to name any names.
All right, that's hilarious. We have a question from Adam Harris who asks, some people believe that the release of Donkey Kong Country helped to extend the life of the Super Nintendo at a critical time when it was competing head-to-head with the Sega Genesis. Was that intentional, or was that a happy accident? So yeah, I guess, was that, like, with DKC being as impressive as it was, did the competition factor into that at all?
Yes, it did. In that, so first of all, what I referred to earlier was when it was presented. Obviously, it was people were amazed at the visuals. But when at its inception, from what I recall, one of the reasons for us creating this game, I think we'd been asked to create a game which would match. So Nintendo were aware of. That Sega were going to bring out an Aladdin game, and it was going to be created with using artists that were pre-ex-Disney, and so these were going to have an amazing set of animations. And so I think they'd asked us if we would be interested in creating a game that would also have amazing animations and kind of rival this Aladdin game that was going to be coming out. And so that was one of the reasons for starting it, and I think it was perhaps around there that we had the idea, or rather Tim had the idea for trying to make these pre-rendered visuals, because he'd, like I say, been experimenting with these ideas. So it was kind of in conjunction with that. I think that's how it came about.
We've got a question from the Gentleman Gamer who says, what's your design philosophy or approach to crafting the fantastic levels and platforming of DKC? There were so many great 2D platforms before DKC, and many since, but none that I've played, say perhaps Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair, that have had the same weight, tightness, and fluidity I can find in a DKC game. So I think he's just asking exactly, what is it do you think that makes the level design of DKC so intuitive?
I think, it was Greg Mills that did the design of all the levels, but I know that when we were talking about it initially and how we would assemble the levels, and also what the kind of layout of the enemies were, we did a lot of ideas that were on post-it notes, and I think we had this idea that we broke down. Again, it was an analysis of other games, but you could break down the movement of. You could take an enemy and say, okay, this is an enemy that's just static, and then you kind of have a post-it for a static enemy, and then you go, all right, but now that enemy can now stay still, and then he moves after a certain amount of time, and then there's an enemy that jumps on the spot, and there's an enemy that does this. And although those enemies weren't defined as to what they were, their actions were defined, and by building them in terms of post-its, you could arrange them on a giant sheet of paper, and you could kind of think about them in an abstract form of thinking, well, how am I going to introduce this idea to the player? So you wouldn't obviously give the player the idea of the post-it which had the enemy that rolled and jumped at the same time and did everything. It would all be kind of, this is the core version of that enemy, and here's a variation of it next, and here's another one, and they're arranged in this form, and they're staggered in this way, so that you could see visually how the player would interact and kind of encounter these different enemies, and the order they would encounter them in. And so, but I think that was one of the things that helped in terms of laying things out, and how when it translated into the game, it wasn't, it was easy to it's easier, I guess, to think, oh, that's where these enemies are, rather than just thinking, oh, I'll put this enemy here because it looks good at the time. It was more about the function, like Steve was saying, it's about design being king in terms of the operation of the enemy and what it does and how it interacts with the player was more important than the visual of why it was there. The fact that it looked good was less important than it playing good.
That absolutely makes a lot of sense. Dr. Stupendous asks, There are a lot of beavers in this game. There's the common enemies, there's the giant naughty boss character, a couple of times, I believe. So why beavers?
Steve, or maybe that's
I don't know. I know it was somebody from Nintendo had mentioned. Oh, you should have. I think they called it coasters. You should have a coaster buddy. It's like basically a dumb enemy that that is basically cannon fodder. He just like walks backwards and forwards, and he's just there to be taken out, really. But why beavers? I don't know. It's not even an animal you get in the jungle, is it?
I suppose not.
And I think the boss beavers were literally just the others ones scaled up and a different colour. I don't think there was anything else different.
I'm gonna be selfish here and insert one of my own questions here. I could be wrong, but I think I remember reading like one of those fake rumors back in the day that I thought was real, like in probably EGM or something, that there was a way to unlock an updated version of the classic Donkey Kong arcade game in Donkey Kong Country, only with fully 3D visuals. Obviously, that isn't in the game, but I'm wondering, was that ever a thought that went through your guys' heads? Did you ever consider adding some kind of like updated version of the game to Donkey Kong Country?
Not that I recall, because I don't know. Well, I mean, in that year we wouldn't have had time to add that. And as I say, as all the code had to go through the machine that was sitting on my desk, then I would have seen that go in, and I didn't put it in anyway. So no, I don't think it was something. I was just trying to think. Are there any? Did we actually add any Easter eggs in particular that were? I don't think. I would imagine anything that we've added has been found by now anyway. So.
Yeah, I can't remember much. I think it was still from a time where I don't think you really got that many Easter eggs, and like Chris says, we were just. We were kind of every waking hour we were working on the game anyway, so we just didn't have time to put any extra bonus stuff in that.
Okay, and that was all the Patreon questions we had for Steve and Chris, except for the final one, which again you can find in the full interview we already had with them, again linked in the description below. So that just leaves the final batch of questions we had for David Wise. So let's get to it. First up, we have a question from Parker409 who asks, what was the most difficult song in the Donkey Kong Country series for you to compose, and how long did it take you, and were you happy with the result?
Yeah, that would have been the Aquatic Ambience took 5 weeks. So that's the longest composition of anything I've ever written. It was the hardest because it was a new architecture, and it kind of worked.
So Raymond Benito asks, when returning to DKC music for Tropical Freeze, were there any challenges updating that style for a modern game?
To be honest, no.
Nice, easy question.
So, I mean, although I was using a different system, I used Cubase and I used Native Instruments and 8DO instruments and that kind of stuff. I was very familiar with using them. So it's just diving back in and using sounds that were obviously a lot more impressive than the ones on the Super NES. So it was the same but different and enjoyable in a completely different way.
Jaden Turner asks, what is your favorite video game soundtrack not done by you?
Oh, that changes on a daily basis as well.
How about right now? Do you have any particular one that stands out at the moment?
I think I've said before, I really like the first Metal Gear Solid score. I think that connects emotionally. And it's just, I often hear it when I go to concerts where they're playing video game music. And that one really, I don't know, I would guess that I don't know the name of the composer. Again, I'm not very good with putting names and things together, but there are some amazing composers out there. So the person who actually put the score together for Metal Gear Solid, it sounded as though they're on a real mission to bring something for the game, and it just brought it alive, and that's a very strong score.
Right, well, Kiddy Kong 1996 asks, apart from the soundtrack, what's your favourite thing about Donkey Kong Country?
It's fun.
That's a good one.
It doesn't take any effort to learn it. You can pick it up, play it, and keep going through the levels and getting better at them. The games I don't really like are the ones, and I certainly don't play the sort of games where it takes a long time to learn how to use it. Oh, there's a big story that you have to go through before you can start playing. And more of the pick up and use the controller and get on with it thing. And again, the games, when they're in development, if you're really itching to pick up the controller and just start playing it, it's going to sell well.
Duron7X asks, what kind of instruments do you like using the most in your music?
I don't know. That's would be the. Well, I don't particularly have a preference for which instrument I'm using, as long as it works well. I mean, I normally start with drums, and once you've got the rhythm going, then it's very easy at that point to start adding the others. But as for a favourite, I really don't have a favourite.
Okay.
All right, well, Boardman asks, if you were given an opportunity to remix a song for Super Smash Bros., DKC or otherwise, what would you choose?
I haven't thought about that. There's been quite a few done already, hasn't there?
Yeah, there have been. But you can choose whatever you want, though. If you want to remix an existing song, that's totally fine.
Let's go for Seashore War then. How about that?
Yes.
Okay, interesting one.
Great. Okay, this needs to happen now. Cam X60 asks, what is a game series you like and would like to compose a soundtrack for a new sequel in that series?
Sorry, say that again.
Sure. If you were able to design the soundtrack for a sequel to a particular game series, what game series would you want to make a soundtrack for?
Sequel. I've always wanted to do a Zelda game, but then who hasn't?
That'd be great, though.
Yeah, I'd love to do a Zelda game. That would be awesome. So yeah, I'll go with that. I'll go with Zelda.
We are getting towards the end now, so this is the second to last question from Joe, and it's more of a statement than a question. It says, are you a god living among us? Your music is so amazing, you can't simply be a mere mortal.
That's extremely kind, but I'm just winging it like everybody else, every other composer and artist and games designer. We just love what we do. But yeah, I still, if I'm hungry, I go to the shops and I'll buy food. If I'm, I go cycling most days, come back and have a shower and then start composing. There's nothing special about me as a person. I just enjoy what I do, and I'm very blessed that other people enjoy what I do as well.
You're far too modest, David. And with that, we're at the end of our Patreon questions for the DKC development team. So once again, I want to give a huge thanks to Greg Males, Steve Males, Chris Sutherland, and David Wise for taking the time to speak with us on DKC's 25th anniversary. Again, you can find links to their full interviews in the description below. Please check them out. They are super informative and provided us details we never knew we wanted. So again, you can find links to all those in the description below. It's super good stuff. And with that, we're about done here. So thank you for watching, and of course, stay tuned to Game Explained for more on Donkey Kong Country in the future, I'm sure, and everything else Nintendo as well. We'll catch you later. Bye.